Good afternoon and welcome to Darwin Days. My name is Greg Scupian and I'll be the host for today's program. We're so glad that you joined us here this afternoon. We're going to learn all about lemurs. Before we get into that, just a couple of announcements. First of all, we have 3 more programs after this one today. And then on Saturday, we're going to be live on the plaza outside of the museum in downtown Raleigh. So we hope that you can join us for the 3 remaining programs virtually today. And then we hope to see you Saturday from 10 to 3 on the plaza. For those of you joining in Zoom, just a couple of quick things. I'm sure you've all used Zoom before, but just to let you know, we do have captions available for you. So if you click on the CC button there at the bottom of your screen, you can select closed captions, and then you can edit them by clicking on show subtitle. That's going to allow you to make them bigger or smaller to your personal preference. For optimal viewing, we recommend using the speaker view. So if you click on the top right of your screen, you can change the view. Speaker view is going to allow you to see the PowerPoint slides and our speaker at the same time. So make sure aside, and then you can change the size of those screens by clicking and dragging on the vertical bar there. And we want you active in the chat, but please just be a good digital citizen. Let's keep it relevant and friendly. To get that chat going, we want to know if you've ever seen lemurs before. It could have been in the wild if you're lucky enough, or maybe at a zoo, or maybe at the Duke Lemur Center where our presenter's from. So drop that in there and we'll get that chat going right now. So I have the honor to introduce our guest, Dr. Matt Borths. Matt is, hey, thanks for joining us. Matt is a vertebrate paleontologist. He is a curator of the Division of Fossil Primates at the Duke Lemur Center and adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Evolutionary Anthropology at Duke. And he's going to tell us all about lemurs. Welcome, Matt, and go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, first, I want to thank everyone for being part of Darwin Day. And right off the top, I want to let all of you know that if it's possible to visit the plaza on Saturday, there will be fossils from the Duke Lemur Center and materials from the Lemur Center there. So it's another reason to stop on by. I'm going to first introduce myself a little bit and tell you how I came to be at the Duke Lemur Center and who I am and where I came from. So I am a paleontologist, which means I study fossils. And so a lot of the stuff that's in my background right now are fossils that are at the Lemur Center. And the way that I became from the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. And Cincinnati, Ohio is sitting on just miles and miles of rock that's basically fossils. And those fossils are part of a coral reef that used to be covering kind of the middle part of the country millions and millions of years before the dinosaurs even existed. And so I grew up kind of fossils that I would find kind of in the backyard. But it was then that I became interested in dinosaurs and woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats and other kinds of extinct creatures beyond the things I was finding in my backyard. But then as I started to learn more about the past, I kind of assumed that all fossils had been found. I thought that being a paleontologist was maybe something that you could do like when I was a kid. But then by the time I became an adult and I could start to become a paleontologist myself, I didn't think that would really be a job because surely all the fossils had been found. It wasn't until I got to university. I went to Ohio State University where I studied geology. And part of the reason I studied geology is because I took a class early on in my career when I was a freshman and discovered that the person teaching the class was a paleontologist. And I thought, this person is doing something with their lives. They must be looking for and discovering new things. And so I went and talked to him and found out that he was doing research and then was open to this whole world of discovery that exists in the world of fossils, that there is lots to find, that there are lots of questions still to ask and answer about the ancient past. And believe it or not, we are still discovering new things about the past. And so in this presentation, if you are interested in fossils, if you're interested in the past, but you have a little bit of that feeling, like as I'm presenting things, I will show you fossils that we have discovered and things we've learned from them. And so it can feel like sometimes when scientists talk about what we've discovered, that there's not very much more room for new people to contribute. And know that that is not the case. Scientists, we talk about things that we've discovered, but then once you get into the community and you start to learn from other researchers, you discover that there's more that we don't know than that we do know. And that's a really exciting thing about being a scientist, is being able to discover new things. And so just to kind of set you up with that I really only decided to commit to being a paleontologist when I was in college. And before that, I was interested in medicine and history and all kinds of other stuff. There's a reason to stay curious and to continue to ask people around you who might have interesting jobs or careers that are really intriguing to you. Ask how they got those jobs, ask what they do, because it's a really important part of discovering what you might want to do with big parts of your life. And so with that, I'm going to share some of what I do as a paleontologist working at the Duke Lemur Center. So this is going to be the story that I call Primitive Primates, which is on the trail of fossil lemurs from Wyoming to Madagascar. And so our story begins at the Duke Lemur Center. So the Duke Lemur Center has a fossil collection that we call the Duke Lemur Center Museum of Natural History. And then there's the living collection at the Duke Lemur Center. And this is what that collection looks like. If you haven't had the opportunity to visit the Lemur Center, what we are is a place that has over 200 individual lemurs that represent many, many species of lemurs. Lemur is a kind of a category of primate, and we'll talk about what that means to be a primate. But these animals that are living basically in Duke Forest, close to Duke University, there are woods and then enclosed habitats where lemurs are able to kind of roam and behave in a way that is close to how they would behave if they were in the wild. And so animals like these shafoks are able to leap through the forest. And researchers come to the Duke Lemur Center to study these amazing animals, to learn more about their biology. And the reason that we do that is because ultimately there's a connection between lemurs and humans. Part of the way we can study that is by studying living lemurs and living humans and kind of connecting our research together. Another way that we do that is through the fossil collection, where we have tens of thousands of specimens. And our mission is to kind of, through the fossil record, connect the lemurs that we have at the Lemur Center to us as the people that are observing them. And in order to do that, we have to follow primates on this epic journey that they have as they go around the world. And so primates are the group of animals that lemurs belong to, and they're the group that we belong to. Other groups of animals that are part of primates include monkeys and other apes. And so if any animal like that, usually found in a tree, usually found with a big brain, usually found with complex social behaviors, those are primates. And their fossil record is one of my favorite things. And in order to study it, it means that researchers have to go all over the place to look for their fossils. So we have fossils of primates, including lemurs, from places like the country of Madagascar, which is off the coast of Africa, from the country of Egypt, which is in mainland Africa, Colombia, which is in South America, and the United States. And so, again, to kind of get it, a couple of basic questions before we wander into the fossil record of primates and follow them on this crazy journey. The first question is, what is a primate? And so here's a picture on the left is a lemur. This is called a ruffed lemur, and this is a picture of an animal who lives at the Duke Lemur Center. Another animal on here is a capuchin monkey, which is a South American monkey, and then a gorilla, which is native to Africa. So within the group of primates, we have this smaller group of primates that we call lemurs. And so lemurs are these animals. And so the question is, like, what makes a lemur different from other types of primates? And then when we think about primates, we think about things that live in trees, we think about things that are furry. How come a squirrel is not a primate? And so there's a couple ways to answer that question. One of them is, as a paleontologist, the way that I like to think about it is by looking at their skeletons, because skeletons and bones and teeth, these are the things that fossilize really well. This is what we're most likely to find in the rock record. And so on the top is a skull of a lemur, and on the bottom is a skull of a squirrel. When we look at the skulls of these two animals, there's a lot of differences that we can observe. But one that I look at right away as a paleontologist interested in primate evolution and fossils is this bar of bone that the arrow is pointing at. It basically connects the top of the skull of a lemur to their cheekbone. On a squirrel, that bar is missing. There's basically a gap behind their eyeball. And that bar is something that all primates have. So monkeys, apes, lemurs, all of them have this ring that goes around their eyes. So that means that you have it too. If you kind of lightly push on the side of your head, you can feel this bone that's coming around the outside of your eyeball. If you were a super intelligent raccoon or squirrel, you wouldn't be able to feel this bone going all the way around your eyeball because those are not primates. Another big difference, a way that we can recognize primates in the fossil record, is by looking at their hands and feet. We look at the hands and feet of a lemur, compare it to a squirrel. Lemurs have this thing called a thumb, and they also have an opposable big toe. And those are really, really useful for helping these animals grab onto trees. This squirrel doesn't have an opposable thumb. Instead, the squirrel actually has like a really, really small, kind of like shrunken, weird looking little finger. And they have really long fingers for the other 4 digits. And so when a squirrel climbs through the trees, they can't grip the way that a primate can. They can't kind of wrap their hands around. Instead, what squirrels are doing is they're using what's at the end of their fingers to grip on. Those are called claws. And so a sharp kind of curved thing at the end of your finger, we call a claw. But of course, I don't have claws, and neither does a lemur. Instead, what I have at the end of my fingers are fingernails. And so fingernails are a trait that we only find in primates. So believe it or not, just looking at your hand, there's a lot of clues that link us to something like a lemur, because we have thumbs, we both have fingernails, and then if we kind of like push on the side of our faces, we find we both have this ring of bone going all the way around our eye that tells us that the fossil record of lemurs is going to tell us something about the fossil record of humans. Fossil record of squirrels is less useful for trying to figure out where humans and lemurs came from. Now, within primates, there are some differences that make lemurs distinct from other groups like monkeys and apes. One of the things that lemurs have is what's called a tooth comb. And a tooth comb is basically like all the lower teeth in the front of their face are kind of smushed together into this thing that basically it's a comb. It's like sticking forward, and they use it for actually fluffing their fur. On their feet, they have this one claw. So they have fingernails on every digit on all their toes and all their fingers, except for on one toe, they have a thing called a grooming claw. And so if you find a lemur in the fossil record, there's going to be one claw on that back foot, and they're going to have a tooth comb, which are all clues that you found a lemur fossil and not a monkey or an ape fossil. And because you, as an ape, don't have a tooth comb, you don't have your teeth in the front kind of sticking forward. And so they should be kind of sticking straight up to match the teeth that are above them. Another thing that makes a lemur is where they're found. So there are about 100 species of lemur. And this is kind of a picture of the crazy diversity these animals have. There are lemurs that are different sizes, some that are as small as this animal in the middle. It's called a mouse lemur that earns its name because it's about the size of a mouse. Then there's animals like the ringtail lemur, which is the animal at the top, which is you see very commonly in places like zoos. And you can see them at the Lemur Center because they're really hardy. They're really adaptable animals. There's also animals like the chafak, which is the leaping animal on the left. And on the right is my favorite species of lemur, an animal called an aye-aye. And the aye-aye is this kind of weird nocturnal animal. It has these giant bat-like ears. It has these really, really long fingers. You can kind of see it holding an egg in its paws right there. And the bottom, that kind of like long, kind of like twig-looking thing is actually one of their fingers that they use, along with these kind of like narrow faces that they have, because inside their mouth, instead of having this like tooth comb that has all their teeth put together, they have ever-growing incisors. So the front teeth in their mouth are basically growing all the time. And so what an aye-aye does is it's basically a lemur that's trying to be a woodpecker. They use their ears to listen for bugs that might be crawling inside of tree bark. Then they use their ever-growing teeth to kind of burrow into the tree bark. And then they use the really, really long fingers to kind of reach in there and skewer the bugs and bring them out. They also can do things like eat an egg, where they'll like burrow into the eggshell, and then they use their finger to actually pull the yolk out. It's really an amazing thing to see. And they're just the most well-adapted and strangest lemurs that exist. And I think that they're just amazing creatures. One of the things that makes a lemur is they're only found on the island of Madagascar. Madagascar is an island that's off the coast of Africa, and Africa is a huge continent. And so looking at this map, it can seem like Madagascar is a pretty small place. But Madagascar is basically the size of like most of the west coast of the United States, like all of California and then parts of Washington State. If you laid it on the East Coast, it would basically kind of cover from like the top of Florida all the way up to almost Maine. So it's like a really big island. It's just Africa's really big relative to everything else. And so on Madagascar, there's lots and lots of habitat for these animals, for lemurs to live in. And they do. Like I said, there are 100 species plus of these animals. And so one way to think about this map is basically in Africa, there are no lemurs. But in Madagascar, there are lemurs. But that hasn't always been the case. There have been lemur-like animals in other parts of the world, and we know that from studying the fossil record. If you want to study the fossil record of primates, you want to study the fossil record of lemurs, you have to look at geological time, which is basically like a long, long time ago. The big divisions in this time are where we can find fossils are the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. The Paleozoic is sometimes called the age of fish. This is the beginning of multicellular complex life, where lots of amazing things get started. Things including fish kind of first appear on the fossil record during that time. The Mesozoic is sometimes called the age of reptiles or the age of dinosaurs. And the Mesozoic ends about 66 million years ago. And that is when the Cenozoic begins. The Cenozoic is sometimes called the age of mammals. And that is a good name for it because this is really when the diversity of mammals explodes. So it's about 66 million years ago, we start to get the earliest relatives of animals that will become primates and will become lemurs and will eventually become things like human beings. Looking at how all of these different primates are organized, we can look at a family tree. And looking at this family tree, we have kind of all other mammals that are also related to primates, but aren't as closely related to each other as we are, on the left side of the screen. Then in the green, we have lemurs. And this split of lemurs happens pretty early in the story of primates. Meanwhile, the monkey and ape lineage kind of continues on and kind of diversifies. And so when we look at this, each of these branches on the primate family tree represent events when a common ancestor for everything else kind of further up the tree would have been on the scene and then diversified. So each of these branches basically become a way for us to go fossil hunting. If we can figure out when the common ancestor for many of these branches on the tree existed, we can target those time periods, rocks from the time when early lemurs might have been getting started, when early monkeys might have got started, and when early apes would have gotten started, to really dive into the story of where this whole diversity that is primates came from. And so, because we're at the Duke Lemur Center, we're really, really interested in this branch right here, where lemurs split off from the rest of primates. And that takes us back almost to the extinction of the dinosaurs. So this is a world map of what the world looked like basically at the end of the age of dinosaurs. In the northern continents, we have early animals that look a little bit like primates. They're animals that are missing a few traits. They don't have the eye bar thing going on, but they do have things like a gripping big toe on their feet. They're all living in the northern continents. Meanwhile, in the south, you'll notice things like South America, Australia, India, and Africa are all kind of cut off from the rest of the world. They're what we call. So you can't walk in Africa, you can't walk into South America, can't walk into Australia from anywhere else on the globe right now. And fortunately, primates get started, but they're able to spread kind of across the northern continents at the beginning of the age of mammals. After a few million years, those early, almost primate-like things transform and evolve into the groups that are true primates. And so if you want to go fossil hunting for primates, the place to go in the beginning of the age of mammals is not the places that we think of as primate-rich places today. So like today, if you want to find lots of monkeys, you would go to some place like the Amazon River Basin in South America, or you might go to Central Africa. There are no primates in those places 55 million years ago. Instead, they're all in the northern continents. And there's kind of a big split that happens very early. And this is the split between the lemur-like animals and the monkey-like animals. The lemur-like animals are a group called Adapiforms. And this is the group that's going to go on and become part of the lemur-like line. And there's another group of animals called Omomyids. And the Omomyids are basically telling us about this early story of the animals that will become monkeys and apes. We find Adapiforms and Omomyids next to each other in the rocks of the northern continents, including North America. And so this is what we call a geological map of North America. It looks kind of like someone's really messy tie-dye project. But what this is actually showing you is basically each color represents a different age of the rocks exposed on the surface of the earth. And the darker the color, the older the rocks are. And so when we look at this map, places like the Carolinas, kind of along the East Coast, and places like Florida, are all relatively young rocks because they're kind of a lighter color. Through the middle of the country, we find this dark green color. That is the end of the age of dinosaurs. And so the reason why you find lots of dinosaur fossils in the western part of North America is because there's lots of rock from the age of dinosaurs that's exposed to the surface of the earth kind of through the western part of North America. Scattered through there are also some chunks of rock that are from basically the end of the age of dinosaurs and then the beginning of the age of mammals. And that is the stuff where we're going to find these early lemur-like animals that are actually living right here in North America at the time. And so there's a reason for that. One of the ways that you get rock is basically by this process called erosion. So this is a kind of a cross-section through what is the beginning of the Rocky Mountains. The reason why in this map we have all this green stuff from the beginning, from the end of the age of dinosaurs and the beginning of the age of mammals through the middle part of the continent is because the Rocky Mountains were basically getting pushed up during the end of the age of dinosaurs and the beginning of the age of mammals. That kind of eruption event is caused by the collision of continents that are pushing new rock up into the air. That new rock comes up and eventually it's going to get broken down through a process called erosion. Wind and water and snow kind of beat up the rocks that are sticking up and they start to get flatter and flatter. And the way that rocks get flatter is they get smaller and smaller and they become things like sand and they become things like mud. That's all dragged down the sides of the mountains and eventually out into flat spaces that we call river basins. And these river basins are basically the middle part of the country. And that is exactly where fossils get deposited. It's in these layers of rock that are off to the sides of mountains that are getting broken down. In all of those layers, we get fossils being deposited. The problem is those layers are building up on top of each other over time. So fortunately, during the last couple of million years, the middle part of North America has kind of bubbled up again because there's kind of deep tectonic forces that are under the middle part of North America that pushed up those ancient rocks from the end of the age of dinosaurs and from the beginning of the age of mammals, exposing all of these layers at the surface that then again get cut by water. And then we can go out fossil hunting in the western part of North America. And so that's all to say, there were probably lemur-like primates living right here in North Carolina about 55 million years ago. But we don't find a lot of their fossils because we don't have this beautiful kind of mountain building event at exactly the time those animals would have been alive. Instead, there was still erosion going on and those fossils aren't being preserved exactly here. We're really lucky that there is a great fossil record of North American primates being preserved to the west of us in places like the state of Wyoming. And so when we go fossil hunting for these early primate animals that are basically the early relatives of lemurs, we go to places like the state of Wyoming. This is a geological map zoomed in just on Wyoming. So again, the same colors. So the green that you see on here is the end of age of dinosaurs. The dark blues and light blues are all much older rocks. And on here you see like this light orange and this gray. Those are places where we can find early relatives of primates in Wyoming that we can go and excavate. And this is what we find when we collect fossils from North America during this time period, about 55 million years ago, is we discovered that there was basically a jungle in the western interior of North America. And in that forest were animals like in the foreground, this lemur-like primate that would have been eating fruit from trees that have really broad leaves. There would have been small kind of terrier-sized horses that would have been roaming along next to them, early relatives of things like dogs and cats that would look more like weasels that were kind of like scrambling through the undergrowth. Lots of turtles, crocodiles, this very kind of tropical world that we have in the middle part of North America 55 million years ago. And so we don't find that beautiful reconstruction that has the fur of all the animals on them when we go fossil hunting, of course. Instead, what we find are material that look like this. So this is what the fossils look like when we actually excavate them from Wyoming. And so on the left is kind of the scattered bones of an animal called Nitharctus that we can very, very carefully remove from the rock and eventually piece together into a beautiful skeleton like this animal called Smilodectes. And these are both these early relatives of lemurs that would have been living on the planet. In this case, these animals are about 50 million years old, living in jungles that used to be where today it's very dry. And I actually want to show you what the world looks like today when we go fossil hunting. So there are expeditions that the Duke Lemur Center has that go out and collect fossils from Wyoming. So we fly or drive out west, and it is not a jungle today. It is a very dry badland environment. They're called badlands because there's not a lot of water that you can find anywhere, which is a good thing because the water brings things like lots of plants, and all of the green stuff on the surface can make it really hard to find fossils. Instead, the rock is just kind of exposed to the surface. And so you can see all of these layers in the Badlands looking out. Those are different flooding events where kind of coming off of the mountain, rivers would have flowed off the Rocky Mountains and deposited mud and sand on top of each other. And there's still rock being laid down. Here over my shoulder is a piece of that Rocky Mountain outcrop. This is called the Uinta Mountains. that are eroding and filling in the basin, and there's still deposits going down. There's kind of new fossils of the future being made in parts of the Badlands. But we're interested in the fossils of the past. And so here I'm sitting on top of rock that's about 50 million years old. And when you get up close to it, it's basically mud. Rain and water slowly exposes fossils on the surface. And so here we have two jaws of a groundhog-sized rodent that would have been living alongside our early primate-like relatives that were part of this ecosystem in ancient North America. And so on the left is Madison Bradley, who's a graduate student at Duke University, and Doug Boyer is on the right, who's a researcher at Duke. And we're out looking for these fossils with a researcher named Alex from the Burke Museum. And John Alexander is an amazing fossil hunter and an amazing primate fossil hunter. And this day he actually found the skull of a primate. So we're looking at kind of like the side of the brain case of one of these early lemur-like primates that was exposed on the surface of the rock. And so once we found this skull, we then kind of carefully looked at the surface of the rock around it. And Dr. Boyer noticed things like part of a wrist bone and part of a tailbone. And so if you have a head, you have part of the arm, and you have part of the tail, it's likely that you have most of the skeleton of the entire animal preserved in this flood deposit. So millions of years ago, this animal died, unfortunately, but was preserved in a way that we could actually get in there and study how it was put together. And so this is over the course of several days, us trying to get this block of rock out. And the reason we want to get the whole block out is because this rock has kept the specimen safe for 50 million years, and we don't really want to mess with a good thing. And so we keep the rock around it because at any time a thunderstorm or hailstorm can kind of pop up out of nowhere. And if you have the fossils exposing the surface any more than they already are, those fossils can actually get really beat up. And you end up not really being able to study them. So we bring them back to the lab where a specialized researcher called a fossil preparator actually takes the fossils out of the rock very carefully using glue and specialized tools to actually stabilize them. And then we can do research to figure out where these early lemur-like primates might have come from and how they're related to each other. So now our story moves from the northern continents to Africa, because eventually we will have to get lemurs to Madagascar, because today we only find lemurs in Madagascar, even though their fossil record begins all the way up in North America. So the way that they have to get to Madagascar is first by going through Africa. So we think somewhere around maybe 50, maybe 20, maybe somewhere between a million years ago. It's hard to say exactly where they crossed in. They come from the northern continent into Africa. And like I said earlier, Africa at this time is an island continent. It's very difficult to walk from one place to the other because there's a ocean basically between places like Europe and Asia and India and Africa. And so the way we think that the primates that would have eventually become lemurs got to Africa is by doing what we call rafting. And so island rafting is basically the process of an animal getting really unlucky. This is a picture of a mangrove swamp. Mangroves are a type of ecosystem that live along the edges of continents and riverways, where basically the plants live in the water. They're not like anchored to the soil necessarily, but they're anchored to each other. And lots of biodiversity exists in these areas that are kind of along river systems and along coasts. Primates love to live in mangroves because there's lots of good food for them. The problem is that you're right on the coast. And so if you're on the coast, you might know that hurricanes happen, cyclones happen, typhoons happen. When those big storms happen, they cause what's called a storm surge. And they push up all of this water that actually can break off part of these mangrove swamps and suck them out to sea. And then these primates that might be stuck in these branches that are trying to shelter from the storm wake up and find themselves in these natural rafts drifting out in the middle of the ocean. One of these natural rafts from the northern continents, where you find the earliest lemur-like primates, went from Europe or from Asia and eventually crash landed in Africa. This is a phenomenon that sailors have noticed, and people out at sea have observed these natural rafts that are kind of out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And given enough time, we think it's likely that this is how we get lemur-like animals from the north to Africa. And eventually, they're going to get from Africa to Madagascar. But before that happens, a really tragic event in primate evolution happens. In the northern continents, all of the primates go extinct. And this happens about 35 million years ago. This is a time period at the end of it's called the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. And the Eocene-Oligocene boundary is basically when Antarctica finally kind of parks itself at the bottom of the South Pole. What that does is it changes ocean currents, and the first big glaciers start to develop across the southern hemisphere. That causes lots of moisture to get sucked out of the atmosphere and start to go into glaciers. That causes the world to become really dry. And we think that forests that used to cover much of the northern continents, including those jungles that used to be across places like Wyoming, disappear. And so the habitat for lots of primates also disappears because of this massive change in the climate. Fortunately, some of those animals got to Africa before this extinction happened. Africa also experienced really, really dramatic extinctions during the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. But one of the groups that survived were the lemur-like primates and the monkey-like primates that were able to get to Africa. And the place that we go to study this early emergence of primates, as we start to kind of put ourselves back together after this big extinction event, is the Fayum Depression of Egypt. And so the Fayum Depression is a desert. It's lots and lots of sand that is just west of the city of Cairo in Egypt. And it's a really amazing place to work because it is both a place to look for fossils and do paleontological excavations, but it's also a place where lots of researchers are doing archaeological research. And so I have always been really excited by things like ancient Egypt and other ancient cultures. And so being able to actually go and excavate alongside some of these places like this ancient temple is really amazing, because underneath this site are things like the fossils of crocodiles and possibly the relatives of animals like primates. Because this is what the Fayum used to look like. Again, we're dealing with a place that's really dry today, but in the past was a very lush jungle-like environment. And so we think it was this kind of mangrove swamp. It was along the coast of northern Africa at the time, where things like this animal on the left, this thing called Arsinotherium, that looks a little bit like a rhinoceros, but is actually more closely related to an elephant, would have been stomping through these ancient forests. In the water would have been the early relatives of things like manatees. And in the trees, we would have had primates. And one group of primates that is living in the trees are the anthropoids. And these are the animals that are basically the common relatives of monkeys and apes. So this is kind of our great-great-grandparents, including great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great aunts and uncles like Egyptopithecus. Egyptopithecus is a monkey-like animal as opposed to a lemur-like animal. And one clue for that relationship is, again, found in the eyeball. So all primates have bone going around the side of their eye. But only one group of primates then has bone in the back of the eye. And that group of primates are the monkeys and the apes, or the anthropoids. And so you and I, we have what we call an eye socket. And that eye socket is something we find in gorillas, and we find it in capuchin monkeys, and we find it in colobus monkeys, but we do not find it in lemurs. And so when we find the skeletons of things like early Egyptopithecus, we find an eye socket and know this is an animal closely related to monkeys and not closely related to lemurs. But we do find the fossils of lemurs alongside these monkey-like animals. This is a specimen of an animal that was recently discovered, or recently described as an ancestor of the eye. The eye is this amazing nocturnal kind of woodpecker-like lemur that is my favorite species. Its early relative is found in the Fayum. One of the things that we can use to recognize an eye is that ever-growing set of front teeth in their jaw. Well, 34 million years ago, there's an animal that had a super long front tooth sticking out of its face that's called Plesiopithecus. Plesiopithecus then gave rise to an animal called Propato that lived in Kenya, which is another country in Africa, about 20 million years ago. And then those animals gave rise to an animal called an eye. And so somewhere between 34 million years ago and now, an animal that was basically an eye that had its like front tooth sticking forward and growing all the time made its way from mainland Africa to Madagascar as part of this larger dispersion of the lemurs going from Africa to Madagascar. Now, that journey from Africa to Madagascar is something that many mammals took going to Madagascar. So at the top is this animal called a tenrec. Tenrecs are basically like punk hedgehogs that are really, really diverse and a really amazing group of mammals that you only find in Madagascar, except for one species that's found in Africa. There's also the fossa, which is the top mammalian carnivore that lives in Madagascar today, which is basically a meerkat relative that has become like an apex carnivore. It's like a bobcat-sized animal that eats things like lemurs. A special group of rodents that lives in Madagascar, and then the lemurs make it to Madagascar between 40 and 20 million years ago. And so, of course, now we want to go to Madagascar to try to figure out where the fossils of lemurs come from. And fortunately, there are lots of fossil sites in Madagascar. So on the right are some of the fossil sites that are represented in the Duke Lemur Center collection. Unfortunately, almost all of those sites only go back to about 12,000 years ago. And so that is really not very much time. Like, it's a long time in human lifetimes, but 12,000 years ago, humans as a species were a thing that were walking around in Africa. Meanwhile, in Madagascar, we have an amazing diversity of animals that were living on the island. And studying these sites from around Madagascar tell us about this very recent past that was in Madagascar. And so these are the skulls of some of the giant lemurs that we've discovered in the fossil record of Madagascar. And so at the bottom is you can see the mouse lemur skull. So mouse lemurs are still alive. The Indri skull next to that is the largest lemur that is alive today. It's an animal that is kind of like, could like fit in my arms. Like they're pretty big, but they're not like something that's massive. The skulls of things like Megalodopus at the top. This is an animal that would have had a skull the size of a gorilla. And so this is a giant lemur that lived alongside things like Archaeolemur, which is called the monkey lemur sometimes. It's basically like a golden retriever-sized lemur that lived in Madagascar. So this is the skeleton of Megalodopus, which is an animal that lived in Madagascar and only went extinct a couple of 100 years ago. Megalodopus is sometimes called the koala lemur because it has these really long front legs and big kind of short back legs and big feet that it would have used for kind of climbing through trees. It would have lived alongside an animal like Paleopropithecus, which is sometimes called the sloth lemur because it looks a lot like a sloth. It has big long claws that it used to kind of like hang under branches. Both Megalodopus and Paleopropithecus are both lemurs. They're just extinct lemurs that are not part of the ecosystem in Madagascar today. What's amazing is when we find these fossil sites that are only a couple of 100 years old, we find the fossils of Megalodopus and Paleopropithecus right alongside the fossils of things like the shafak at the top or this brown lemur that's shown at the bottom on the right. So these are modern species that would have lived alongside these giant animals that eventually went extinct. Other giant things that used to live in Madagascar and only went extinct a few centuries ago include the elephant bird, which is like a 15-foot tall bird. It's one of the largest, heaviest birds that ever existed. And it laid an egg that was 2 gallons of yolk. At the top of this ecosystem would have been the cave fossa. So like I said, the modern fossa is about the size of a bobcat. The cave fossa would have been about 1.5 times bigger than that. So it's almost like, I think of it as like a small mountain lion. And these animals are amazing. Like modern fossas are basically like fuzzy lightning. Like the way that they hunt lemurs in the trees, they have to be better climbers than lemurs. And lemurs are really acrobatic in the trees. And so fossas are even better. Like they're just incredible to watch. They would have been part of this ancient ecosystem that had giant lemurs. It had mini hippos, the size of pigs, 15-foot tall birds, and the modern diversity of Madagascar that's still really cool and amazing. This fossil record that we find in Madagascar is really recent because of where it comes from. So in order to find a lot of these fossils, we find them in a type of rock that's called limestone. Limestone is different than sandstone and mudstone, which is the kind of rock where we find fossils in Wyoming. Instead, limestone is a rock that's deposited basically underwater, usually in marine settings, so in oceans. And it's basically like the raining down like bodies of microorganisms that eventually kind of glue themselves together. Eventually, limestone is exposed at the surface by like tectonic events, kind of pushing the bottom of the ocean up above the surface or sea levels dropping. That kind of dries out the surface. That limestone then gets wet. And so groundwater and rainwater act on it. Limestone is very, very, very slightly basic. And rainwater is very, very slightly acidic. And so what that means is the limestone actually dissolves when it hits rainwater and groundwater. That forms little pockets, basically a Swiss cheese, through all of the limestone. When the water drains out of those systems and eventually erosion exposes those pockets, we call those pockets caves. And so caves are a phenomenon that are mostly found in limestone. Those pockets in the limestone rock are perfect places to collect the carcasses of animals that are living on the surface. They might wash in, or they might even be put in by the animal that gets lost in a cave. And so when we go to Madagascar, where lots of these fossils come from, are from these kind of landscapes that are just dominated by caves. This is a place in northeastern Madagascar called the Ankarna Reserve. And Ankarna is basically just limestone, and then all the erosion that's happened, and then caves and caves and caves. And in it, we find the evidence of this amazing ecosystem that only went extinct in Madagascar about 300 to 800 years ago. And this is a picture from inside one of these caves. one of the researchers who works with the Duke Lemur Center, working at a site called Antilitalo Cave. And so this is basically the only way you can get in is by rappelling a couple of 100 feet down into the cave, filling up bags and buckets with fossils that are just piled on the bottom of the cave, and then sending them back up where paleontologists from Duke University and from Madagascar and from all over the world really would sort through them and identify things like bats and lemurs and crocodiles in this material. There's still excavations going on right now, and this site is really one of my favorites. It's not part of the Duke Lemur Center project, but it's just so exciting that I want to talk about it. It's called Simenpetsuits, which is in southwestern Madagascar. And it's a cave that is still flooded, but that didn't slow down the paleontologists who recruited a group of cave divers to work with them. The cave divers go into the water and bring up fossils of things like this horned crocodile that lived in Madagascar and only went extinct, we think, in the last 1,000 years or so. They also find things like this lemur fossil, and you can tell it's a lemur because you can see that ring of bone going all the way around its eyeball. And like I said, all of them are gone by about 1,000 years ago. The thing that happens about 1,000 years ago is humans really become densely populated on the island. We think that humans arrived in Madagascar. It's really unclear, actually. The error bars kind of keep getting pushed back further and further in time. It may have been as long as 10,000 years ago that humans first arrived on the island. But the large population growth and the arrival of things like livestock and domesticated rice and other crops arrive in Madagascar about 1,000 years ago. And that's really when the extinction starts to take place. And so what's really fascinating about the extinctions that are going on in Madagascar today is they're really part of the same extinction pressures that went on 1,000 years ago. And lemurs today are one of the most endangered species of mammals on the planet. And it's because people who are living in Madagascar, like people everywhere, need food for their families. And so trying to figure out how to make space for the native animals that live on the island, but also give people the space that they need to provide for their families is a really important part of what we're trying to figure out, working with people in Madagascar and kind of taking their lead in what they need, while also kind of looking out for how we can help conserve space for lemurs and other animals that live in Madagascar. And so about 1,000 years ago, we go from something that looks like this, with giant lemurs living alongside the groups we see today, something that looks like this. So today we have basically the small lemurs left, but they are very endangered. And the Lemur Center is part of larger teams that are working to try to figure out how to make sure we conserve the animals while also helping people make a living. And so the Sava Conservation Group at the Duke Lemur Center works really actively working with farmers who are in especially the northeastern corner of Madagascar to really figure out and solve this problem that is extinctions are taking place, but people need resources. How do we solve that problem? And it's by working together and listening to each other in a really active way. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for going on the journey around the world with me. And I'm excited to have a conversation and answer any questions you have about the story of lemurs and primates around the world.
Thank you, Matt. That was excellent. I certainly learned a lot. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Thinking of that last slide you just shared about some of the work that the Duke Lemur Center does in terms of like conservation on the ground in Madagascar, Hugo wanted to know, is there something that us as a single person can do to help these species?
I mean, the biggest thing that we can do, well, there's kind of different scales, because of course, one of the things that is accelerating a lot of the pressure on these animals is rapidly changing environments in response to kind of global changes in the climate. So steps that we can take very locally that include using fewer resources. So if we have the opportunity to recycle materials or reuse materials, if we have the opportunity to choose not to use as many fossil fuels by riding a bike or by driving less, these are really small things that a single person can do, and it doesn't seem to have much of an impact. But the thing to always remember is there are hundreds of millions of people in the United States, and there are billions of us on the planet. So by taking very small steps as individuals, those small steps can actually accumulate and have a really big effect. More locally in places like Madagascar, there's a lot of support that we can offer, usually by helping nonprofits that are working in Madagascar themselves. There are a lot that are based in Madagascar, owned by Malagasy researchers, and by conservation groups based in Madagascar. And the Lemur Center works really actively with those. So if you have the opportunity to offer financial support, that is something that's really important for helping to give people the resources they need to protect the space and help people as best they can.
Great answer. Thank you. So, in the beginning, you said you got interested in fossils because of dinosaurs. And I feel like a lot of people probably watching today got into fossils and evolution and stuff because of dinosaurs. What made you switch from dinosaurs to primates?
That's a really important journey and one that I totally understand. Like I sometimes joke that my 5-year-old self would be a little disappointed because I don't study dinosaurs. And some people can have a real chip on their shoulder about that. But I understand. Dinosaurs are amazing creatures that really demonstrate what is possible in biology. I like to say that if we didn't have the fossils of these giant animals, I don't think we would have made them up. And instead, it shows just what the diversity of life can really be. For me, my journey into primates ultimately was driven by wanting to study something that was a little closer to kind of how we built our modern ecosystem. One of the reasons why the age of dinosaurs is so amazing is because the world was very, very, very different. There were no ice caps. There were jungles and forests like all the way above the Arctic Circle, which is a crazy thing to think about. And in a lot of ways, it's an ecosystem that's very foreign to us. There are no grasses, for instance. Like grasslands are a ecosystem that's a very recent thing in the grand scheme of the history of life. Flowering plants were only part of the very end of the age of dinosaurs. And so one of the things that drove me into paleontology was wanting to connect modern ecosystems to the past to really understand kind of where did we get our modern ecosystem from, so we can then use that to try to understand like where we're headed in the future. And really that is something that we have to study through the lens of the age of mammals, because it's only then we start to get glaciers as a really important part of the climate system. And then we start to have flowering plants the whole time, and modern animals are part of the landscape. So really it was part of me as a researcher wanting to study, use the fossil record to understand modern ecosystems. That then brought me into more recent questions. And the primates are a really interesting way to look at climate change and to look at ecological change, because primates can only live in certain kinds of ecosystems. So where you find them and where you don't find them tells you a lot about how the climate has changed in a place locally.
All right. So knowing that now, is there like one fossil or something that you hope to discover that would just be, answer one of these questions, these larger questions that you just laid out?
I mean, I would say the holy grail of paleontology, one of the holy grails of paleontology, is anything from Madagascar that's older than 20,000 years old. The fossil record of Madagascar is basically, we have fossils from the end of the age of dinosaurs. There's really amazing dinosaurs actually from Madagascar, things like Majungasaurus and Rapadosaurus, and these just like amazing, like crocodiles that look like armadillos. And then end of the age of dinosaurs hits, and our fossil record in Madagascar goes dark. And the reason for that is because, as far as we can tell, there weren't new rocks being laid down that are exposed to the surface today. That's kind of like we have this convenient buildup of the Rocky Mountains in the western part of North America that tells us about the early part of primate evolution in North America, but we don't have something like that in Madagascar. There are very likely some pieces of evidence of what ancient Madagascar looked like. That are preserved maybe in some of these coastal rocks that we find in parts of Madagascar. We mostly find things like manatees and whales and fish today, but it's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. And so one of the dreams of basically everyone who works in Madagascar is to try to find anything that basically tells us about when these animals showed up. The way that we know when lemurs went from Africa to Madagascar is basically two sources of evidence. One is the fossil record of Africa, when we can see when things like the earliest eye that we discovered that was discovered by researchers in Egypt was discovered. So we know that there's an eye thing living in mainland Africa, and eventually it gets across to Madagascar because we have eyes in Madagascar today. But we don't actually have like the early eye relative in rocks in Madagascar. So we don't know exactly when lemurs arrived, which is frustrating and also a huge opportunity for discovery for Malagasy paleontologists and also paleontologists working with them.
All right. And then going back to that video that you showed, was it in Montana or Wyoming?
Mm-hmm. Wyoming.
In Wyoming. So you showed us the skull of this primitive primate sticking out of the ground. How common is it to find fossils? And do you have any idea what sort of densities these ancient primates were living in? Were they numerous, or were they few and far between?
The probability of finding primates are very rare to find, which is why it's always really exciting when we find them. For a couple of reasons. The most common things that we find when we go to places like Wyoming are animals that are living in water, because basically sandstone, mud are all being laid down by water. And so we need the animal like a lemur to get like washed in, to get preserved in the rocks. And so things that are living in the water already and that die in the water are going to be much more common. So things like turtles, things like fish, things like crocodiles and alligators, they are very common in the fossil record. But saying very common is kind of a relative term, because they're not like just melting out of the rocks. Like you have to walk every couple of feet, maybe I'll say like every 10 feet in some of these rocks. There's some of those fossil dense sites in the age of mammals in North America. You have to go like 10 feet to find like a chunk of crocodile or a chunk of turtle. And then, going a whole lot farther to try to find early chunks of things like tapirs or horse relatives, or eventually, if you're really lucky, a primate. And so that's part of the reason why so much fossil hunting goes on in the dry parts of the world. There are little outcrops on the East Coast of rocks that are about the age of the stuff that's in Wyoming. It's just patchy, and it's also covered by soil and by plants. And so if you find like a scrappy crocodile piece every 10 feet, in Wyoming, it's no big deal. Like find a scrappy crocodile scoot, go a few more feet, find this crocodile tooth. In North Carolina, like going 10 feet means like getting a lot of soil out of the way, getting a couple trees out of the way, and it can really be tough. So a lot of fossil hunting that happens in North Carolina happens on places like coasts and along river cuts and along highway cuts, because that's where we've actually exposed the rock. And so in Wyoming, we're very lucky that it's dry and we can walk and find what are ultimately very rare things, even for the most common objects. And then for the primates, we found 2 skeletons. We actually got really lucky in that field season. We were out for about 2.5 weeks, and we found 2 relatively complete skeletons of these lemur-like primates in Wyoming. And then probably a dozen like fragments of jaws and little teeth. And then relative to that, we found like dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of other plant-eating animals. So things like horse relatives and tapir relatives. And then we only found like 2 or 3 pieces of carnivores, because meat eaters, we know from looking at modern ecosystems that there are not a lot of meat eaters relative to the number of plant eaters. And we know that plant eaters that like to eat things like leaves and kind of shrubby things on the ground, those are animals that can find lots of food very easily. And so they tend to be pretty dense on the ground, whereas primates are a little pickier in the kind of food that they eat. They tend to like to eat fruit, especially, and sometimes like really new leaves. From looking at the teeth of these early lemur-like primates that we find in Wyoming, we know that they would have liked basically really soft leaves and fruit. And those are resources you have to move around a lot to find. So you're not going to find large populations of lemurs living in the western part of North America during that time. And so we don't really have a great idea of how many there were at any given spot or at any given time. But we know lots of herbivores, some lemurs, and then like very, very few carnivores that would have been part of these ecosystems.
And so when you're out in these sites, I imagine you can't collect every fossil, but are there certain things that help you reconstruct the ecosystems that these primates were living in that you do take back?
Yeah, we pay a lot of attention to the plants that were alongside these things. I'm a vertebrate paleontologist, which means I mostly study the remains of animals that have backbones. But that doesn't mean that I only collect those things, because you need everything to kind of put together the whole picture of what these ecosystems look like. And so we pick up things like like snail shells, and we pick up pieces of leaves that might have preserved, because fossil plants also exist. They help us kind of tell the larger story. We also pick up things like the actual rock, because by taking rock samples, especially rock samples that include ash that would have come from these volcanoes that were part of like the uplift of the Rocky Mountains, that ash that's raining down and becoming part of the groundwater and soils around the western part of North America are how we can actually get dates out of rocks. Those new rocks that are put out by ash basically have atoms in them that change over time. And those atoms, based on how much they've changed, can be used to figure out how old a rock is. And so we collect that to try to figure out how old the rocks are that we're working on. So we pick up rocks, we pick up leaves, we pick up snails, and then we also pick up animals. And the biggest thing that we try to find when we're collecting mammals is we get really excited about teeth. Because teeth in mammals are basically rocks. They're like 98% mineral. So they fossilize really, really well. Another amazing thing about teeth is there's a pretty decent relationship between the size of a tooth and the size of an animal. And so if you just find one tooth, you can actually get a pretty good estimate of how big the animal was when it was alive that had that one tooth. The tooth also tells you what kind of food the animal liked to eat. And people who are experts in looking at all the bumps and grooves that are on a tooth can actually identify what kind of animal it is, mostly based, if it's a mammal, on teeth. And so you can pick up a tooth and say, this is an early horse, this is an early primate, this is an early rodent, and then you can put together the ecosystem just based on this tiny little tooth fragments. So those are also something that we also try to collect a lot of if we find them, is we get really excited when we find teeth because they have so much information packed into them. I should also say a piece of data that we pay attention to, not in the field necessarily, is what researchers who work on living animals tell us. This is one of the amazing things about the Lemur Center, is because we have researchers studying the biology of living lemurs. We actually, as a paleontologist, it seems like I mostly want to study fossils, but I also pay a lot of attention to what people learn about living animals, because that helps me kind of put the muscles on the bones and figure out how big these animals' brains were, what different parts of their brain might have looked like, and then what that tells us about this, how big their ears were, and how good their eyesight was, and how good their sense of taste was, how they would have moved. So there's researchers who study like how lemurs can jump from tree to tree, what muscles they use to do that, and what that means for their skeleton. So then we can take a fossil skeleton of a lemur-like animal and use evidence from a living lemur to help put together an extinct animal. So we actually have paleontologists who don't really study fossils very much. They are people who study living animals, so we can connect that to the extinct things. So there's a lot of research on ecosystems that actually takes place back in the lab from researchers that aren't with us in the field collecting fossils.
That's great. I like how you tied it into studying living animals. Well, Dr. Borths, it looks like we are just about out of time. I want to thank you again for taking the time here to tell us all about primitive lemurs. And I want to extend the invitation again for those of you watching at home. We have a couple more programs virtually this afternoon, and we're going to be out on the plaza this Saturday, November 13th from 10 to 3 p.m. So if you're in the Raleigh area this weekend, please stop by and join us there. Thanks for attending Darwin Day.
You'll see the skull of Megalopithecus there.
Very cool. Yes, not to be missed. Well, thanks again, Matt, and thanks everybody else for attending.
All right, thank you so much.